The moment Inez Wells stepped off the westbound stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the dry heat of June 1879, she told herself the only reason she had come all the way from Missouri was for her sister, and she almost believed it. The town of Caldwell sat along the Kishom Trail like a rough gem half buried in red dirt, full of cattle drovers, saloon music, and the kind of men who wore their history on their faces. Inez stood on the boardwalk outside the stage depot with a single leather trunk at her feet and a bonnet that had seen better days, squinting against the afternoon sun. She was 24 years old, brown-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a stubbornness that her mother had always said would either save her or ruin her. She had come west not because her life in Missouri had been particularly bad, but because her younger sister, Clara, had written her 3 desperate letters in as many months, each one a little more ragged at the edges than the last. Clara had married a cattleman named Roy Totham 18 months prior, and the two of them had settled on a spread of land south of Caldwell, near the Cherokee Strip. Clara's letters spoke of loneliness, of land that seemed to swallow a person whole, of a husband who worked from before dawn until after dark and left her with nothing but wind and silence for company. The third letter had contained a single line that broke something loose in Inez's chest. "I think I am forgetting who I am out here, Inez, and I am frightened." So Inez had packed her trunk, kissed her mother on the cheek, and climbed aboard the first stagecoach heading west. She had not expected Bernard Hartwell. But there he was, leaning against the post of the stage depot with his arms crossed and a worn hat pushed back on his head, talking to Roy Totham about fence lines and water rights with the kind of easy authority that came from years of knowing exactly what you were doing and why. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad in the shoulder, with dark hair that curled a little at his collar and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something solid. When Roy spotted Inez stepping off the stage, he raised his hand and crossed the street, and Bernard Hartwell uncrossed his arms and followed without being invited, which was the first thing Inez noticed about him. "Inez, you made it," Roy said, pulling her into a brief and somewhat awkward embrace. He was a decent man, Roy Totham, though not a demonstrative one. "Clara will be very glad to see you." "And I will be very glad to see her," Inez said, and meant it entirely. "This is Bernard Hartwell," Roy said, gesturing to the man who had followed him across the street. "He ranches the property adjoining mine to the north. Good neighbor. His ranch is called the Hartwell Spread." Bernard Hartwell took off his hat, which Inez thought was a good sign in a man, and he nodded at her with something that might have been respect. "Miss Wells, Roy's told me about you. Has he?" Inez looked at Roy, who shrugged in a way that suggested he had not said very much. "Well, Mr. Hartwell, I hope whatever he said was charitable." "He said you were capable," Bernard said, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "In this country, that's about the highest compliment there is." Inez looked at him for a beat longer than she intended to, and then she looked away at the street, which was dusty and loud with the sound of horses and the distant bellowing of cattle being driven through the far end of town. "I suppose it is," she said. The ride out to the Totham Ranch was long and warm, and Inez sat in the back of Roy's wagon with her trunk and watched the flat Kansas landscape roll past her like something being unfurled. Bernard Hartwell rode alongside them on a big gray horse for the first several miles, talking cattle prices with Roy in the unhurried way of men who have had the same conversation many times and do not mind having it again. He did not speak to Inez again until he reached the fork in the road where his own property began, at which point he pulled his horse to a stop and touched the brim of his hat. "Welcome to Kansas, Miss Wells," he said, and then he turned the gray horse north and was gone in a dust cloud before Inez had thought of a single thing to say in return. Clara was waiting on the porch of the ranch house when Roy's wagon rolled up, and she launched herself off the steps before it had fully stopped moving. She was 21 now, blonde where Inez was brown, softer in the face, with their mother's blue eyes that had gone a little shadowed since the last time Inez had seen her. She flung her arms around Inez and held on with both hands, and Inez held her right back, and felt the full weight of the 3 months of letters pressed against her ribs. "You came," Clara said into Inez's shoulder. "Of course I came," Inez said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped," Clara said. "I didn't know." They pulled apart, and Inez looked at her sister's face carefully, the way she had learned to look at things in the careful, assessing way that drove most people a little crazy. Clara looked tired, but she also looked relieved, and the relief was enough to satisfy Inez for the moment. There would be time for the harder conversations later. The Totem Ranch house was a solid 2-room structure with a covered porch and a root cellar dug into the side of a low hill behind it. It was not a luxurious home, but it was a real one, and it had the beginnings of something comfortable about it, the kind of place that could be a home if someone put enough warmth into it. The surrounding land was flat and golden, threaded with a dry creek bed and bordered to the north by Bernard Hartwell's property, which was marked by a line of cottonwood trees that had somehow found enough water to grow tall. On the second morning of her visit, Inez walked out to those cottonwoods simply because they were the most interesting things she could see, and because Clara and Roy were having a quiet argument about money that she did not wish to witness. She stood beneath one of the big trees and looked north across Hartwell land, which was noticeably different from Totem land in that it had a kind of ordered industry about it. The fences were properly maintained. The cattle she could see in the distance were fat and unhurried. There was a main house of considerable size, built from both timber and stone, and not far from it, perhaps a quarter-mile from the property line, there sat a small separate structure, a little house really, with its own door and a window facing south, empty and still in the morning heat. She did not think about the little house again until 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, Inez had settled into the rhythm of her sister's life with the practiced ease of a woman who had always known how to make herself useful. She helped Clara with the garden, which had been somewhat neglected, and with the cooking, which Clara had been doing alone for too long. She rode with Roy in the mornings when he would allow it, learning the land. She read aloud to Clara in the evenings from the 2 books she had brought from Missouri, and she watched her sister slowly, carefully unfurl the way a flower does when it finally gets enough sunlight. Bernard Hartwell came by the Totem Ranch on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Inez's arrival, to discuss a shared water rights matter with Roy. He arrived on the gray horse again, tied it at the post, and accepted a cup of coffee from Clara with a nod that managed to convey genuine gratitude without using any extra words. He sat at the table in the Totem kitchen, and Inez sat across from him because there was nowhere else to sit, and she noticed that his hands around the coffee cup were roughened from work but steady, and that he listened when Roy spoke, which was rarer in a man than it should have been. "Need to file a paper at the county seat to make the water agreement official," Bernard said. "I can ride into Caldwell with you Friday if you like." "I'd appreciate that," Roy said. There was a pause in the conversation. Inez looked out the window at the line of cottonwoods. "Those trees on your property line," she said, not quite intending to speak aloud. "The cottonwoods." Bernard looked at her. He had the kind of eyes that paid attention. They were dark gray, like good iron, and they were paying attention now. "What about them?" "Nothing in particular," Inez said. "They're just the only trees of any size I've seen since I arrived. I find them restful." "My father planted them," Bernard said. "When he built the place 20 years ago, he said a man needed something to look at besides flat ground or he'd go strange in the head." "Your father sounds like a reasonable man." "He was," Bernard said, and something shifted briefly in his expression, a quick passage of something genuine and old. "He passed on 2 years back." "I'm sorry," Inez said, and she meant it in the straightforward way that she meant most things. "Thank you," Bernard said, and he looked at her as if the simple sincerity of it had surprised him a little. They rode into Caldwell together that Friday, all 4 of them, because Clara had said she needed thread and Inez wanted to see the town properly, and Roy had not objected. The town was more alive on a Friday. the end of a cattle drive having deposited a number of drovers in various states of celebration along the main street. They were not dangerous, merely loud, and Inez navigated the boardwalk with her chin up and her elbows ready, which made Bernard Hartwell, who was walking beside her while Roy and Clara went to the dry goods store, laugh for the first time in her presence. It was a good laugh. Not a polished one, not the kind of laugh that was performed for the benefit of others, but a real one that came from somewhere lower than his throat. "You look like you're preparing for a cavalry charge," he said. "I am simply walking," Inez said with great dignity. "You're walking like you expect the street to argue with you." "In my experience," Inez said, "it usually does." He laughed again, and this time she let herself smile just a little because it seemed fair. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, all four of them, at a table with a checked cloth and food that was simple but hot. Bernard Hartwell talked about the coming autumn drive, about the market prices in Wichita, about the strange wet spring that had left the grass unusually tall. He asked Inez about Missouri, about what kind of work she'd done there, and she told him about the millinery shop where she'd worked for 2 years after her father died, and about the small schoolhouse where she'd helped teach reading on Saturday mornings. "You teach," he said. "I help teach," she said. "There's a distinction. Why did you stop?" She looked at him. "I came here," he nodded slowly. "And will you stay?" It was the question she had been turning over in her mind since she arrived, the same question Clara asked with her eyes every morning at breakfast. "I don't know yet," Inez said honestly. "I came for my sister. After that, I haven't decided." He nodded again and did not push the matter, which she found she appreciated. On the ride home, Roy and Clara sat together in the front of the wagon and Bernard rode alongside. And at one point, they rode through a low spot in the trail where the evening light hit the tall grass at an angle that turned it the color of copper wire. And Inez thought that she had never seen anything quite like it in Missouri. That flat, open, burning beauty of the Kansas plains at the end of a summer day. She caught Bernard looking at her looking at the grass, and instead of pretending she hadn't been staring at the landscape like a person dumbstruck by it, she said, "It's extraordinary, isn't it?" "Every night," he said. "I've never gotten used to it." "I don't think you're supposed to," she said. "I think the point is that it stays extraordinary." He looked at her with that steady gray attention of his for a moment longer than was strictly conversational. "I think you might be right," he said. It was Clara who first mentioned the little house, though she framed it delicately, the way Clara always framed things she was afraid of. They were sitting on the porch in the cooling evening air, shelling the last of the garden beans, and Clara said, without looking up from the work, "Roy told me that Bernard Hartwell has a small house on his property that he built for a hand he was expecting, but the man never came. It's just sitting empty." Inez shelled beans and said nothing. "It's close to our property line," Clara continued, "close enough that you could walk between the two places. Roy says Bernard's mentioned that he might rent it." "Why are you telling me this?" Inez said, though she already knew. "Because your trunk is taking up half of the back room," Clara said, and then smiled the smile that had been getting her out of trouble since she was 4 years old. "And because I don't want you to feel like you have to leave. And if you had your own place nearby, you wouldn't have to leave, but you also wouldn't have to stay crammed into our back room, and I think you would be happier." "You want me to rent Bernard Hartwell's little house," Inez said flatly. "I want you to be comfortable," Clara said. "The proximity to Bernard Hartwell is incidental." "Is it?" Clara's smile went a little sideways. "Mostly." Inez finished her handful of beans and looked out at the darkening sky. The truth was, she had been thinking about staying. She had come for Clara and found, unexpectedly, that she had also come for the land, for the broad horizon, for the particular quality of silence that lived in the spaces between gusts of wind. She had come expecting to stay a few weeks, and found that weeks had passed, and she had not once looked for a return stage schedule. But she had no real plan, no income, nothing to keep her in Caldwell beyond her sister and a feeling she couldn't quite name yet. "I would need to speak to him about it myself," Inez said finally. "Of course," Clara said, "and I would need to find some kind of work. I can't simply sit in a house on a man's property without contributing." "The schoolhouse in town has been without a proper teacher since Mrs. Dobbins went back east in March," Clara said, "and this time she was not even trying to look innocent." "How long have you been planning this?" Inez said. "Since your second letter from the road," Clara said. "I love you, Inez." Inez looked at her sister for a long moment, and what she saw there was real, not just the soft loneliness she'd seen in Clara's letters, but something genuinely rooted now, something that had been missing. Having Inez here had put it back, that particular kind of courage that people draw from the people who have known them longest. "I love you too," Inez said. "You are a terrible schemer." "I learned from the best," Clara said. 3 days later, Inez rode to the Hartwell property on Roy's most reliable horse and knocked on the front door of the main house. Bernard answered it himself, which surprised her. She had somehow expected a hired hand or a housekeeper, but he opened the door with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a look of mild and genuine surprise on his face. "Miss Wells," he said, "is something wrong at the Totem place?" "Nothing at all," she said. "I've come to speak to you about the small house on your property, if it's convenient." He looked at her for a moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the Hartwell house was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. It was spare, the way most working ranches were spare, but it was clean and it had an order to it that suggested a man who thought about where things belonged. There were books on a shelf, which she noted. There was a good stone fireplace. There was a desk by the window with papers spread on it that he moved aside with practiced efficiency before offering her the chair beside it. She told him plainly what she was asking. A reasonable rent, temporary in nature, with the understanding that she would be taking up the teaching position in Caldwell if they would have her. She told him she was capable of maintaining the property without assistance, that she did not intend to be any kind of imposition on his daily running of the ranch, and that Clara's proximity was the primary reason for the choice of location. He listened to all of it the way she had noticed he listened to Roy, completely, without interrupting, with those attentive gray eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he said, "The rent I'd charge would be very low. The house has been sitting empty, and that's no good for a building. I would prefer to pay a fair amount," Inez said. "Then we'll call it fair," he said, which she suspected meant he would name a price and she would accept it because arguing about it further would take longer than either of them wanted to spend on the subject. He named a price that was indeed low but not insultingly so, and she accepted it, and they shook hands across the desk like two people conducting reasonable business, except that when his hand closed around hers, she had the distinct and inconvenient awareness that it was a very good handshake, firm and brief and honest. "Can I show you the house?" he said. "Please," she said. The little house was perhaps a quarter-mile from the main Hartwell house, close enough to the property line that she could see the Totem place in the distance. It was small, one main room with a fireplace, a separate alcove with room for a bed, a window facing south and one facing east, and a lean-to behind it that could shelter a horse. It had been built with care. The wood fit together tightly, the door hung true, and the window frames didn't rattle. The fireplace drew well, Bernard said. He had built it himself. "You built this," she said. "I built most of what's on this property," he said, and there was no pride in it, just the stating of a fact. She stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly, looking at the walls and the ceiling and the south-facing window with its frame of open Kansas sky. It was small and plain, and it smelled of cedar and dry earth, and she felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she wanted to live in it. "I'll take it," she said. She moved in on a Saturday at the end of July. With Roy's wagon and Clara's help and Bernard Hartwell's tacit acknowledgement of the event, in the form of a cord of firewood he had left stacked neatly beside the lean-to, which she had not asked for, and which she found herself touching with one hand before she went inside, as if testing whether it was real. The first few weeks in the little house were the best kind of busy. She had her interview at the schoolhouse in Caldwell, conducted by the 3 members of the school board, all of them decent enough men who were visibly relieved to have a qualified applicant and who hired her on the spot. School would begin in September, which gave her August to prepare. She spent that month learning the landscape, riding Roy's horse along the creek beds and the rolling swells of land, and beginning to understand the particular grammar of the place, what the sky meant when it went that particular shade of green, which direction the wind came from before a storm, where the land dipped into gullies that could flood without warning. Bernard Hartwell she saw with a regularity that was never quite planned and never quite accidental. He rode the fence line that bordered his property from hers most mornings, and their paths crossed often enough that it began to feel like a kind of schedule, though neither of them ever suggested it was one. They talked about small things at first, the way people do when they are cautious. The cattle market, the condition of the road into town, the fact that one of his horses had thrown a shoe and the farrier was delayed. Then one morning he found her sitting on the ground beside the south-facing window with her knees pulled up and a letter in her hand, and he stopped his horse and looked at her with a directness that she had come to recognize as simply the way he was, not intrusive, just present. "Bad news," he said. "My mother," she said. "She's not well. It's not critical, the doctor says she'll recover, but she's been ill and it worries me." He got down from his horse, and he sat down on the ground beside her, not inside her boundary of personal space, not trying to offer anything more than company, and they sat for a little while in the morning light with the sound of his horse cropping at the short grass nearby. Inez found that she did not feel the need to say anything else, which was unusual for her. She was a person who filled silences, but his silences had a quality to them that made filling unnecessary. "She'll recover," she said finally, not because she was certain but because saying it helped. "I hope so," he said simply. "Were you close to your father?" She asked because she remembered what he'd said in the Totem kitchen and because she wanted to know. "Yes," he said. "He was a fair man, hard but fair. He came out here in the 1850s when Kansas was a different kind of dangerous. Border troubles, the abolitionist fight, all of it. He believed in this place even when it was trying very hard to convince people otherwise." She looked at him. "Do you believe in it?" He picked up a stem of dry grass and turned it between his fingers. "Yes," he said, "though I've had my doubts. There were 2 bad winters in a row in 74 and 75. Lost a lot of cattle, nearly lost the whole operation. I thought about going back east." He paused. "I didn't." "What kept you?" He was quiet for a moment. "This," he said, and gestured at the land around them, the open sky and the golden grass and the line of cottonwoods in the middle distance, and the fact that I'd built it and I didn't want to walk away from something I'd built. Inez understood that completely and said so, and he looked at her with a kind of recognition that landed somewhere she was not prepared for. She was not, she told herself firmly on the walk back to her little house, developing feelings for Bernard Hartwell. She was here for her sister. The little house was simply a practical arrangement. The fact that she had noticed the color of his eyes and the quality of his laugh, and the way he sat on the ground beside her without needing to make it into anything, was not relevant to anything at all. She told Clara none of this because Clara would have had something to say about every word of it. September came and school began, and Inez discovered that she loved teaching with a completeness that she had not fully expected. The schoolhouse in Caldwell held 23 children between the ages of 6 and 14, from ranching families and farming families, and the families of the various tradespeople who kept the town running. They were not, on the whole, children who had had the luxury of loving school before, and winning them over was work, real work, the kind that required patience and creativity and the willingness to fail at something on Monday and try it differently on Tuesday. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and a little bit of history, and she told them stories when the day was long and the attention was flagging. Stories about places she'd never been but had read about rivers that went all the way to the sea, about mountains so tall they had snow on them even in July. The children watched her with the particular attention of children who have discovered that an adult is genuinely interested in their minds, which is one of the rarest things a child can find. She rode the 7 miles to Caldwell in the mornings on the horse Roy had agreed to sell her, a sensible bay mare she named Jane, and she rode home in the afternoons through whatever weather the Kansas sky had decided to serve up that day, which in September could be anything from blazing sun to thunderstorms of a ferocity that she had not previously understood was possible. Bernard was the one who found her on the road on the afternoon of the worst of those storms, 3 weeks into the school year. She had waited it out for as long as she could at the school, but it had become clear that the storm was settled in for the evening, and she had decided to ride anyway. She was perhaps halfway home when the rain went from steady to immediate and serious, the kind of rain that reduced visibility to the length of your arm and turned the road to instant mud. And Jane, a sensible horse in most respects, was not especially fond of lightning. She had managed to get Jane to the shoulder of the road and was standing there with her hand on the mare's neck, talking her through it, when she heard the sound of another horse and turned to see Bernard coming toward her through the rain with 2 slickers thrown over his arm and an expression that was somewhere between relief and exasperation. "I thought you might have tried to ride through it," he said, dismounting. "I did try to ride through it," she said. Jane objected. "Jane has more sense than you," he said, and handed her one of the slickers. "Thank you," she said, pulling it on over her soaked dress. "How did you know to come?" "I saw you leave the direction of town from the ridge," he said. "I knew the storm was coming fast." He said it simply, as if it was nothing, as if riding out in a thunderstorm to check on her was just a natural function of being in the same part of the world. They waited out the worst of it beneath the overhang of a limestone outcropping not far from the road, the horses calmer now that they were out of the direct rain, and Inez stood next to Bernard Hartwell in the gray light of the storm, with the sound of rain and distant thunder all around them, and was very conscious of how much space he was not taking up. He was a tall man and a broad-shouldered one, and he stood with his arms crossed against the cold of the rain, and she thought, watching him from the side, that he was the most straightforwardly good person she had come across in a long time. Not good in a simple-minded way, not good in a way that required any performance, just steady and decent and real. "You do this often?" she asked. "Ride out in storms to check on your neighbors?" "When I think they might need it," he said. "Am I a neighbor?" she said. "Or a tenant?" He looked at her then, and something in the look was different from the previous ones, less guarded, more open. "I don't think of you as a tenant," he said. The rain eased before dark, and they rode back to the Hartwell property together, and he made coffee in the main house while she dried out by the fire, and they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace drinking it, and talking for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the storm. She told him about the children at the school, about a boy named Thomas Pickering who could multiply faster than she could, but had never in his life been told he was clever, and about a girl named Rosa Reyes whose family had come up from Texas, and who wrote her letters beautifully but got ashamed when the other children noticed. Bernard listened to all of it with the same complete attention he brought to everything, and then he said, "It matters what you're doing. Teaching. Making those children feel like they count for something," he said. "That matters more than the reading and arithmetic, though those matter too." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "You think about people that way," she said, "about whether they count for something. Don't you?" "Yes," she said, "but not everyone does." He set his coffee cup down. "My father used to say that the land was honest. It didn't care who you were before you got here. It just asked what you were going to do with it." "And the people on the land," she said. "Same question," he said quietly. "What are you going to do with the life you've got?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm had settled into a soft and steady rain. "I used to think I knew the answer to that," she said. "I thought I was going to stay in Missouri and teach and eventually have a small, comfortable life, and that would be enough. And now," she looked at the fire, "now I think enough is a smaller word than I thought it was. there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people have just said something real and are both taking a moment to honor it. She stood to leave shortly after that, pulling on the still damp slicker, and he walked her out to where Jane was rested and dry in his barn. He held the lantern while she checked the saddle. Their hands came close together on the saddle horn without quite touching. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "Thank you for the conversation," he said. She rode the short distance to her little house in the soft rain and lit her lamp and sat down at her table and thought about very little for a long while, which was its own kind of answer. October brought a cooling of the air and a change in the light that made the landscape look like it was made of hammered gold, and Inez found herself walking her property line in the evenings simply to watch the sunset do what it did to the Kansas sky, which was something new every single night, and something she had given up trying to describe in letters home, because the words were never quite large enough. Clara came to visit twice a week, and they sat on Inez's little porch and drank tea and talked the way sisters talk when they have found each other again after a period of distance, honestly and without gaps, the way a conversation resumes after a long pause. Clara was better, genuinely better. The loneliness that had been in her letters had not disappeared entirely. The land was still vast, and Roy was still a man of few emotional words, but she had her work and her garden and her sister nearby, and the shadow in her eyes had thinned to something manageable. "Bernard Hartwell came by the fence line yesterday," Clara said one afternoon, with the particular tone of a woman who is being deliberately casual. "He does that most days," Inez said, equally casual. "He stopped to talk for rather a long time," Clara said. "He's a conversational man," Inez said, "when he has something to say." Clara looked at her with the expression of a woman who has known her sister for 24 years and is not remotely fooled by anything she does. "Inez, Clara, you like him. He's a perfectly decent neighbor." "Inez," Clara said, "I have seen you tolerate perfectly decent neighbors your whole life. This is different." Inez looked at her tea. "It cannot be different," she said. "I came here to be close to you. I'm a school teacher. I live in a small house on the man's property. It would be foolish and inappropriate." "None of those are reasons not to have feelings," Clara said. "I didn't say I have feelings." Clara said nothing, which was worse than anything she could have said. The truth was that Inez had stopped pretending, at least to herself, somewhere in the weeks that followed the storm. The mornings when she heard his horse on the fence line and felt the day sharpen slightly into focus. The afternoons when she found herself hoping he might stop. The Sunday 2 weeks prior when Roy had invited Bernard to dinner, and she had spent 45 minutes being very busy in the kitchen, and had emerged to find him already seated and talking to Clara about something that was making her laugh, and the sight of it had done something warm and not entirely sensible to her chest. She liked him. She liked him with a thoroughness and a specificity that she was beginning to recognize as something more than like, and it frightened her because she had not planned it and she could not see clearly where it led. What she had not considered, because she was generally better at understanding other people than herself, was whether he felt the same way. She found out on a Saturday in late October, not from anything he said directly, because he was not, generally speaking, a man who said things indirectly, but he was also a man who had learned caution the hard way and was not inclined to make himself vulnerable without some reason to think it worthwhile. She found out because she saw him reading. She had ridden to the main house to return a pair of fence-mending tools he had lent her the previous week, tools she had used to fix a section of her fence line that she had fixed imperfectly the first time, and had gone back to fix correctly, because she did not like doing things imperfectly. She knocked and got no answer, and walked around the side of the house toward the barn to leave the tools in their proper place, and came around the corner of the house to find Bernard sitting in the strip of afternoon sunlight on the south-facing side with a book open on his knee. He had not heard her coming, and she stopped before she rounded the corner fully, not to spy on him, but because the sight of him stopped her physically. He was leaning back against the house wall with his long legs stretched out, and his hat on the ground beside him, and his face tilted slightly toward the page. And there was something about him in that unguarded moment that was different from every other version of him she'd seen. He looked younger and less armored and completely himself in the way that people look when they don't know anyone is watching. The book, she could see from where she stood, was a well-read one, its spine bent from many openings. She must have made some small sound because he looked up, and for 1/2 second before his expression settled into its usual steadiness, she saw him, the real underneath of him, surprised and open and looking at her with something that he had not yet gotten around to composing. "Miss Wells," he said, and bent to pick up his hat, which was the only slightly awkward thing she had ever seen him do. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I brought your tools back." She held them up. "Leave them by the barn door," he said, and then, "Come sit for a minute, if you want." She went and put the tools by the barn and came back and sat on the ground beside him in the strip of sunlight, which was warm and very good on a cool October afternoon. He had closed the book, his thumb marking the page. "What are you reading?" she asked. He held it out. "Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America." "For pleasure," she said, genuinely surprised. "Is that strange? It's not commonly thought of as leisure reading," she said. "My father read it," he said. "He read it to understand why this country worked the way it did, or tried to. I read it for the same reason. There are things out here," he said slowly, "ways that people treat each other, ways that the land gets used and who gets to use it, that don't sit right with me, and I try to understand the shape of why not." Inez looked at him carefully. "You mean the Cherokee land," she said. "The Strip." He met her eyes. "Among other things. This land we're ranching on was their land within living memory, and the way it changed hands was not honest or fair, and I think a man ought to know that about what he has, rather than pretend it came from nowhere." She was quiet for a moment. "Not many men out here talk about it that way." "Not many men out here talk about much that matters," he said, and there was a flatness in it that was not bitterness, just the same honest directness he brought to everything. "Is that why you live alone?" she asked, and then caught herself. "I'm sorry, that's none of my concern." "No," he said, "it's all right." He was quiet for a moment. "I was engaged once, 4 years ago. She was from Wichita. She came out here for a month and decided she couldn't do it, the isolation and the work of it. She went back home." He paused. "I didn't blame her. It's not a life that fits everyone." Inez looked at the golden afternoon light on the grass. "Does it fit you?" she asked. "I used to think it only fit me," he said. "Just me and the land and the work." He turned the book over in his hands once. "I'm less certain of that lately." The sunlight lay warm between them. A hawk crossed the sky above the cottonwoods, tilting without effort on the air. "Bernard," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and she heard it land between them differently than she had expected, like a stone dropped into still water. "Inez," he said, and it was the first time he had used hers, and the sound of it in his voice was something she felt rather than heard, something low and warm and quiet. They sat in the sunlight for a long time after that, not saying anything of great significance, talking about the coming winter and the wood supply, and whether the school board would approve the additional reading books she had requested. And all of it was perfectly ordinary and completely unlike anything she had experienced before. She rode home in the early evening with her hands easy on Jane's reins and the first star coming out above the flat horizon, and she thought, well, there it is. She did not, however, make any move to say or do anything about it, because she was 24 years old and sensible and had an entire life she was building here, a job and a home and her sister close by, and she was not going to risk any part of it on the strength of an afternoon in the sunlight. She might have gone on not making any moves about it for quite some time, had it not been for Roy Totham. Roy was not, by nature, an interfering man. He minded his own business with a thoroughness that sometimes bordered on neglect. But he was also, in his way, perceptive, and he had known Bernard Hartwell for 3 years and his wife's sister for 4 months, and he had eyes. He said nothing to Inez about it. He said something to Bernard. She did not find out exactly what Roy said, and she suspected she never would because Roy would not repeat it and Bernard was too honorable to gossip. But whatever it was, it resulted in Bernard Hartwell appearing at the door of her little house on a Tuesday evening in November with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face of a man who has made a decision, and is not entirely certain how it is going to be received. She opened the door and looked at him. "Inez," he said. "Bernard," she said. "I'd like to talk to you," he said, "if this is a good time." "Come in," she said, and stepped back. He came in and she gave him coffee and they sat at her table, which was small enough that the space between them was narrow, and he held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "I think you know what I want to say." "I'd rather you say it," she said, "so we're both certain." He was quiet for a moment. A log settled in the small fireplace. The wind pushed at the south-facing window. "I've been very careful most of my life," he said, "about what I let matter to me. When Mary went back to Wichita, I told myself that was the answer, that I was the kind of man who was better alone, that I was the kind of man who was suited to work and land and not much else." He paused. "I believed that for 4 years. And then you moved into this house and started riding past my fence line every morning on that bay mare, and talking to me about Tocqueville and Thomas Pickering and the quality of light at sunset, and I stopped believing it." Inez did not say anything. She was watching him with the full force of her attention. "I love you," he said. "That's what I came to say. I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I know you have your life here and your work and your sister, and none of that requires me. But I've been sitting with it long enough that it started to feel dishonest not to say it." Inez looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the first cold wind of November moved through the cottonwoods with a low and continuous sound. "Bernard," she said, and she reached across the table and put her hand on his where it held the coffee cup, and she felt him go very still. "I moved into this house because of my sister. That is true, but I stayed in this house because of you." She paused. "I am not a person who says things I don't mean, so I want to be very precise about this. I love you too. I have been pretending that I don't for approximately 2 months, and I am very tired of pretending." He looked at her hand on his, and then he looked at her face, and what she saw in his expression was something she did not have a word for, because it was not simply happiness. It was the look of a man who has been holding himself braced against something for a very long time and has finally been told he can put it down. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it carefully like something valuable. "We should take this slowly," he said. "You're new to this place and I want you to be certain." "I am," she said. "You might feel differently in a month," he said. "I might," she said, "but I won't. I know my own mind, Bernard." "Yes," he said, and the smallest version of his good real laugh was in his voice. "I've noticed that about you." November and December passed in a way that Inez would remember for the rest of her life as the most acutely beautiful months she had ever lived through, not because everything in them was perfect or easy, but because everything in them was lit from within by the knowledge of what was growing between her and Bernard. They took it slowly, as he'd said, which in practice meant that the morning encounters on the fence line became deliberate instead of incidental, and that Sunday dinners began to alternate between the Totham house and the Hartwell house, and that he came to her little house 2 or 3 evenings a week, and they sat by her fire and read and talked, and sometimes, as November gave way to December and the cold became real, she fell asleep in the chair and woke to find that he had put a blanket over her before he left. She found the blanket on a Thursday morning in early December, folded neatly across the chair, and she sat with her morning coffee and looked at it for a long time and thought that love was very frequently expressed in the smallest and most practical of gestures, and that this particular gesture was one of the most eloquent she had ever encountered. She told him so when she saw him that afternoon, which made him look at the ground briefly in the way he did when something had gotten past his defenses, and then he looked back at her with those steady eyes and said, "You were cold." "You could have woken me," she said. "You needed the sleep," he said. She took his hand. They were standing at the fence line in the cold December afternoon, and she took his hand in both of hers and said, "Bernard, I would very much like it if you kissed me. I have been patient for 2 months, and I think that's long enough." He looked at her with a combination of surprise and something that was rapidly becoming delight, and then he said, "Have I been making you wait that long?" "You have been being very gentlemanly," she said, "and I appreciate it, but I'm not fragile and I know what I want." He stepped closer, which in the cold December air felt like moving into a warmer zone entirely, and he put one hand alongside her face with the same care he'd shown when he held her hand at the table, that quality of treating something as valuable, and he kissed her with a thoroughness and a warmth that she had not been fully prepared for, which was saying something given that she had been thinking about it for 2 months. When he pulled back, he looked at her face in the cold light and said, "Inez." "Yes." She said, "Stay," he said. "Not in the little house, in the main house. Marry me." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something large and irregular behind her ribs. "That is a very impulsive thing for a very careful man to say," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks," he said. "That's not impulsive, that's considered." She laughed, which fogged in the cold air between them, and he was smiling, that real smile that she had worked so hard to get the first time and that came so easily now. "Yes," she said. "Bernard, yes." They were married in the Caldwell church on a Saturday in February 1880, with Roy and Clara and half the town in attendance, because Inez's students had apparently told their parents, and the school board members had told their neighbors, and the thing had become somewhat public property before either of them had properly organized their intentions. The church was cold and plain and full of people, and Inez wore her best dress, which was blue, and Bernard wore a clean dark coat that she had never seen before and that fit him well. And when they stood in front of the preacher, she was not nervous, which surprised her, because she was generally a person who felt things acutely. She felt entirely right, which was different from not feeling anything. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere after a long journey, of looking around and understanding that this was where you had been going. He put a ring on her finger that had been his grandmother's, a thin gold band that he had sent for from his aunt in Virginia, and that had arrived the week before, and she felt the weight of it as something permanent and real. The preacher asked her if she took Bernard Hartwell for her husband, and she said yes with such clarity and directness that the preacher blinked once, and Bernard squeezed her hand, and Clara made a small, undignified sound from the front row that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. They had a wedding supper at the Totham house because it was the largest interior space available, and Roy had been persuaded to allow it by a combination of Clara's management and his own genuine goodwill toward Bernard. And it went on until very late, and involved a fiddle player from the saloon and more food than any of them could properly account for. Later, riding the short distance home to the Hartwell house in the cold February night with her hand tucked into his arm, and the stars very bright, and the horses very quiet, Inez looked up at the sky and thought of her mother in Missouri, who was recovered now, and had written the most gracious and slightly teary letter imaginable in response to Inez's news, and she thought of the first letter Clara had sent, the one that had said, "I am frightened." And she thought of herself stepping off the stagecoach in Caldwell with her leather trunk and her worn bonnet, and the story she had told herself about only being here for her sister. "I was always coming here," she said aloud. Bernard looked at her with the easy warmth that had replaced the old guardedness, the look she had come to think of as just his actual face when nothing was hiding it. "What do you mean?" "I told everyone, including myself, that I came to Kansas for Clara," she said, "and that was true, but I think I was also coming here, to this." She tilted her head at the sky, the land, the man beside her, the whole of it. "I just didn't know it yet." He turned her hand over in his arm and held it. "I think some things find you," he said, "regardless of what route you take." "I think so too," she said. They moved Inez's few belongings from the little house to the main house in March, and the little house was left standing, clean and maintained, which was Inez's idea. "Someone will need it," she said, and she was right, as she was right about more things than could be entirely convenient for the people around her. Spring on the Hartwell spread was a revelation. Inez had arrived in the heat of summer and passed through the fire-colored autumn and the ice-edged winter, and spring was something else again, a green that came up from the ground with a force that seemed almost aggressive, as if the land had been saving it and was now releasing it all at once. The creek that had been dry when she arrived was running with clear water, and wildflowers came up along its banks in colors she hadn't known Kansas possessed. She continued teaching through the spring term, riding Jane to Caldwell in the mornings, with the pleasure of a person who loves their work and loves coming home to something even more. Thomas Pickering's family, at her recommendation, had arranged for him to attend a secondary school in Wichita in the fall, which she considered one of her finest achievements. Rosa Reyes had won a spelling competition in front of the full school and had not been ashamed at all, and the look on her face had been something Inez thought about often. Bernard expanded the ranch operation that spring, adding 20 head of cattle and bringing on 2 additional hands, a man named Pete who had been riding with a trailing outfit and was tired of moving, and his younger brother Sam who was learning the trade and looked up to Pete with an earnestness that made Inez think of Clara, and she told Bernard so, and he said, "I had a feeling you'd adopt the whole crew eventually." And she had said she was not adopting anyone, she was simply observing. And he had smiled in a way that indicated he found this position unconvincing. She had been right about someone needing the little house. In May, a young widow named Hetty Marsh arrived in Caldwell from Oklahoma Territory with a 4-year-old son named James and nothing else to speak of, having come to work at the dress shop and having nowhere to live. Inez heard about it from the woman who ran the dry goods store and went home and told Bernard about it at supper, and he said, "The little house," before she had gotten to the point of the story. "Yes," she said. "Tell her the rent is whatever she can manage," he said. "And that James can come to the spread any time he likes. Pete and Sam will be glad of the company." She looked at him across the supper table. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, and passed her the bread. Hetty Marsh moved into the little house in June, and James did indeed become a regular fixture at the spread, following Pete and Sam around with wide eyes and eventually learning to ride on a very patient old gelding that Bernard kept for precisely that kind of purpose. Hetty was a quiet and self-possessed woman who had been through something difficult and come out the other side still standing, and Inez liked her immediately and completely. The summer of 1880 went by in a way that Inez would later describe as the summer everything grew. The ranch grew. Her school enrollment grew. Clara grew, in the sense that the last of the distance had gone out of her eyes, and she was genuinely and solidly at home in Kansas now, not just surviving it. And Inez knew, by the time August came and the heat sat down on the plains like something with weight to it, that something else was growing too. Something she confirmed when she rode into Caldwell in the middle of August and had a conversation with the doctor that answered the question she had not quite admitted she was asking. She told Bernard that evening, after supper, when the lamps were lit and the night sounds of the spread were settling into their familiar pattern outside the windows. She sat across from him and said, plainly, as was her nature, "I'm going to have a baby." Bernard Hartwell, who was a steady man who was not given to large external expressions of his internal experience, put both hands flat on the table and looked at her with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not just happiness, though happiness was a large part of it. It was wonder. He looked at her with genuine, ungoverned wonder, the same way she sometimes looked at the Kansas sky when it did something extraordinary, as if he was confronting something so good that his ordinary composure had no protocol for it. "Inez," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "Yes," she said, and reached across the table. He held her hands in both of his very tightly, and they stayed like that for a while without speaking, which was one of the things she loved best about him, that he understood when words were less than the moment required. They told Clara first the next morning, and Clara sat down on the porch steps and cried in the happy way, pressing her hands to her face and saying, "A baby." "Oh, Inez," and Roy shook Bernard's hand with a warmth that was notable from a man of his reserved nature, and Pete and Sam received the news with considerable enthusiasm, and Hetty Marsh brought a honey cake to the Hartwell house and said simply, "Congratulations," with a smile that had real joy in it. And James, who was 4 and therefore pragmatic, asked if the baby would want to share his toy horse, which Bernard told him was a very generous offer. The months of Inez's pregnancy were not, for the most part, dramatically difficult ones. She was healthy and determined, and had no interest in being treated as anything other than capable, which she made clear to Bernard early on, and which he accepted with the understanding of a man who had learned, over the preceding months, that arguing with Inez about her own capabilities was an occupation with very low returns. She taught through December, which caused some comment among the more conservative members of the school board, but the children needed a teacher, and she was the teacher, and that was the end of the discussion, as far as she was concerned. She stopped teaching at the beginning of January, not because anyone required her to, but because the baby was due in early February, and the ride to Caldwell had become genuinely difficult in the cold. She spent January reading and managing the household with the additional energy she had always brought to everything, and driving Bernard mildly to distraction by rearranging the kitchen to a more logical configuration and reorganizing his desk to a system that she maintained was superior to his previous one, and which, he had to admit privately, actually was. Their son was born on the 12th of February, 1881, which Inez noted was almost exactly 1 year to the day after their wedding, and which she considered a tidy coincidence. He arrived in the early morning with Clara present, and the doctor from Caldwell who had ridden out the night before when it became clear the baby's schedule was committed, and Bernard, who had been awake for the entirety of the night, and who had sat in the hallway outside the bedroom door with his hands clasped, and his head bowed in a way that Clara said later looked like a man holding himself together through sheer determination, came in when it was over and looked at his son for the first time with an expression that made Clara quietly leave the room, because it was too private to witness. They named him Thomas James Hartwell, Thomas for the boy at school who deserved to be told he was clever, and James because James Marsh from the little house had asked Bernard very seriously the week before if the baby might have a name James in it, and Bernard had said he thought that could be arranged. Inez held her son in the early February light and thought about the stages and the roads and the letters and the open Kansas sky, and the way things find you regardless of what route you take, and she looked at Bernard sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand on Thomas's back, and the expression on his face that she had no word for, and she thought that she had come here saying it was for her sister, which was true, and that it had become everything else as well. Thomas Hartwell was a good-natured and extremely alert infant who demonstrated early on that he had inherited his mother's habit of watching everything very carefully and his father's habit of waiting until he had something definite to say before he said it, which made him, Clara said, almost unnervingly well-balanced for a person of 4 months. The summer of 1881 was a full one. The Hartwell spread had its best cattle season yet, with prices up in Wichita and the herd in excellent condition. Inez returned to teaching in September with Thomas handed into the capable and very willing care of Hetty Marsh during school hours, an arrangement that worked beautifully for everyone, and that gave Hetty some additional income, which she needed, and gave Inez her work back, which she needed in a different way. The children at the school welcomed her back with the kind of enthusiasm that was genuine and slightly chaotic, and she had 3 new students that fall, including a pair of twins from a family that had just come through from Texas, and she loved the work just as much as she had the first year, which she had wondered about, whether having a child would change the way she felt about other people's children. It did not. it deepened it. She and Bernard had fallen, by that second year, into the kind of daily life that is sometimes underestimated because it looks from the outside like routine, but from the inside is the continuous low hum of real contentment. Morning coffee before the hands arrived. The fence-line check that was sometimes his and sometimes hers, since she had never given up writing. Supper when the light went long and gold, and Thomas sat in his chair with the serious expression of a person who is watching adults very carefully in order to understand what they're doing. Evenings by the fire, reading, or talking about the thousand small and interesting things that life on a working ranch in the Kansas plains presents to a person who pays attention. They talked in those evenings about things that mattered to them, about the Cherokee Strip and the injustice of it, about the way the land had been taken, and the way that history sat like something unresolved in the very ground beneath them. Bernard had, the previous year, begun contributing a portion of the ranch's earnings to a fund for the education of displaced Cherokee families, a small gesture in the face of a very large wrong, but one he made consistently and without fanfare. Inez had a girl in her school that fall, the daughter of a mixed-race family who had come up from Indian Territory, and she made very certain that girl was treated with the same attention and dignity as every other child in the room, and she said so plainly when she had to, which she had to twice, and after the second time she did not have to again. Clara had news of her own by the end of that second autumn, which she delivered to Inez across the kitchen table of the Tatum house, with a kind of trembling joy that Inez recognized and answered immediately by getting up and holding her sister for a long time. Roy, when he heard about it, bought a new colt, which was Roy's way of celebrating. The colt was a fine chestnut animal that James Marsh from the little house immediately fell in love with, and was allowed to visit every single day, which made both the colt and James very happy. Clara's daughter was born in the spring of 1882, a bright and loud and opinionated baby who Clara named Inez, which caused the original Inez to sit down very suddenly and press her hands to her face in exactly the same way Clara had done when she heard about Thomas. "You didn't have to do that," Inez said. "I did," Clara said. "She needs to know where she came from." Inez looked at her sister across the bed and thought about the letter, the third one, the one that said "I am frightened." And she thought about the stagecoach and the leather trunk and the story she had told herself about why she was going. And she thought about everything that had come after, all the unexpected acreage of it, the love and the work and the land and the small house, and the man on the gray horse and the son who watched the world with serious gray eyes and the classroom full of children who were learning that they counted for something. "Thank you," she said to Clara. "Thank you," Clara said back. The fall of 1882 brought a change in the weather and a change in the school board, which voted in new members who were, on balance, more progressive about what was taught and how, which Inez took as an opportunity to request an expanded curriculum and additional books, and a small library shelf for the classroom, all of which were approved, which was a genuine surprise. Thomas Pickering, who had gone to Wichita the previous year, wrote her a letter in November to tell her he had passed his examinations and was going on to study engineering, and she read this letter 3 times and showed it to Bernard, who said, "There it is," which was exactly right. Bernard was, by that point, a man who was very comfortable in the life he was living, which was not something he had previously been able to say with certainty. The ranch ran well, not without difficulty. There was always difficulty in the cattle business, and in the business of Kansas weather, which remained an ungovernable thing. But it ran well in the sense that it was tended by people who knew what they were doing and cared about doing it right. Pete had become his most reliable hand, and had himself been talking about finding his own land nearby, which Bernard encouraged, and Sam had developed into a real horseman with a particular skill for training young horses that was worth noting. And Bernard was comfortable in himself, which was perhaps the more important thing. The man who had sat alone on the south side of his house reading Tocqueville and telling himself he was the kind of man better suited to solitude had been replaced by a man who came into the kitchen in the early morning and found Inez there with her hair down and Thomas on her hip and the coffee already hot, and who felt the specific and unrepeatable fullness of a life that had exceeded everything he had been careful enough to want. He said some of this to her one evening in December when Thomas was asleep and the fire was going, and the snow that had started that afternoon was coming down properly outside, laying a silence over the spread that was peaceful and complete. He said it not as a speech but as the kind of thing that comes out when two people have been talking for a long time and have arrived somewhere honest. "I want you to know," he said, "that everything we have, it's more than I knew how to want, before you came." Inez looked at him from across the fire. "You're telling me I did you a favor," she said. "Yes," he said, without any irony. "I moved in because of my sister," she said, with great primness. "You moved in because of your sister," he agreed. "It's important that the record reflects that." "The record," he said, "reflects whatever you need it to reflect." She laughed, and he laughed, and the snow came down outside, and Thomas slept in the back room with the small breathing of a person who is deeply and completely safe, and the fire crackled and the lamps burned warm, and outside the cottonwoods that Bernard's father had planted 20 years ago stood in the snow with their bare branches against the dark winter sky, patient and enduring, exactly where they had always been. By the spring of 1883, the Hartwell spread had grown again, this time with a proper bunkhouse for the hands and a small addition to the main house that Bernard and Pete built together over the course of 2 weeks in April, adding a room off the back that would, eventually, serve a purpose Inez had been thinking about quietly for several months. She had not said anything to Bernard about it yet, because she was the kind of woman who preferred to be certain before she made announcements, and she was not quite certain yet, but she had a feeling, which for Inez was close enough to certainty to plan around. She was certain by May, and she told him on a morning that was warm and clear and smelled of the green that came up every spring with such force, when they were standing at the fence line looking out at the cottonwoods, and Thomas was toddling in the grass beside them with the very serious business of picking up a stick. "The room at the back of the house," she said, "is going to be needed." He looked at her and she watched him understand, and what crossed his face was that same ungoverned wonder, the same expression he'd had the first time, and she thought that this was perhaps the thing she loved most about him, that nothing about loving her and their life had become ordinary to him, that he was still capable of looking at it like it was extraordinary. "When?" he said. "November," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Thomas looked up from his stick and said, "Papa," with the satisfaction of a child who has located his favorite person, and Bernard reached down and picked him up and held them both, his son on one arm and his wife against his side, standing in the spring morning on the land that had asked him what he was going to do with his life, and had waited patiently for the right answer to arrive. Their daughter was born in November 1883, arriving in the same early morning hours that Thomas had, and she arrived with considerably more noise, which Clara, who was present again, said was a very good sign in a girl. They named her Eleanor, for Bernard's mother, who had come to Kansas with his father in the 1850s, and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of great practical courage, and Eleanor Hartwell grew up to justify every syllable of her name. Hetty Marsh, by that point, had become as much a part of the life of the Hartwell spread as the hands themselves, and James was 9 years old and riding with real confidence, and had a particular friendship with Thomas that would last them both their entire lives. Hetty had met a widower in Caldwell named Edward Crane who ran the livery stable, and by the following spring she had, with the quiet purposefulness of a woman who has survived enough that she knows what she wants, agreed to marry him and move to town, leaving the little house empty again. Inez and Bernard stood at the window of the main house the morning after Hetty left and looked at the little house in the early light. "Someone will need it," Inez said. "They always do," Bernard said. He was right. By summer, there was a new family in the area, a young couple who had just arrived from Illinois, the husband hoping to start a small operation, the wife expecting their first child and looking overwhelmed in the way of people, confronting more land and more sky than they had planned on. Bernard offered them the little house at the same terms he had always offered it, whatever they could manage, and they accepted with the relief of people who have just been told that the place they have arrived is not as indifferent to them as they feared. The wife was 23 years old and named Martha, and she and Inez had coffee twice a week through the pregnancy and talked about everything. And Inez was there when Martha's daughter was born in September, and she held the baby while Martha slept, and the young husband, whose name was Calvin, sat at the table with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands in the particular exhaustion of someone who has just watched something enormous and is not sure whether to laugh or cry. And Inez said to him, "She's extraordinary, your daughter. You did very well." And Calvin laughed in a broken way that released something, and she was glad. This was the Hartwell spread, and this was the life of it, and it went on in the way of lives that are well-rooted. Through seasons and years, through hard winters and good summers, through school terms and cattle drives and the slow, steady accumulation of days that were individually ordinary and collectively irreplaceable. Thomas Hartwell grew up to be tall and dark-haired like his father, with his mother's eyes and her habit of watching everything carefully before he spoke, and he was good with the land and good with people, which is a combination that is rarer than it should be. Alina grew up loud and opinionated and brilliant, with a talent for mathematics that made Inez's former school board eventually look at each other with some consternation, because she surpassed everything they had provided for in the curriculum by the time she was 12, and arrangements had to be made. Inez taught for many years, and she was good at it in the way that she was good at everything, which is to say completely and with the full force of herself. And the children of Caldwell and the surrounding range grew up knowing that their teacher expected them to be capable and told them so and meant it, and that this expectation was one of the best things that had ever happened to them. Bernard ranched his land for the rest of his long life, and he ranched it with the same steady care that he brought to everything, and the Hartwell spread became known throughout the county as a well-run and decent operation, the kind of place where the hands were treated fairly and the cattle were treated well, and the neighbors could rely on the man at the head of it. He never stopped reading. The bookshelf in the main house grew over the years into something that surprised people who came in from outside and expected something other than what they found, and he and Inez read together and argued about what they read in the good, productive way of two people who respect each other's minds and enjoy the argument. And Thomas eventually claimed that he had learned more from listening to his parents argue about books than he had from any formal education, which Inez said was an uncharitable assessment of formal education, and Bernard said was probably fair. On an evening in the summer of 1895, when the cottonwoods were full-leafed, and the grass was tall, and the children were grown enough to be off doing their own things, Bernard and Inez sat on the porch of the main house in the long evening light and watched the sun go down over the Kansas plains, which had been doing it every evening without consultation or permission for as long as the earth had been here, and would continue doing it long after, and which had somehow not diminished in its capacity to be extraordinary. She had her hand in his, which was not remarkable because this was generally where her hand was in the evenings when they were on the porch, which was most evenings. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said about the land, that your father thought a man needed something to look at besides flat ground or he'd go strange in the head?" "I remember," he said. "Your father was very wise," she said. "He was," Bernard agreed. She looked out at the cottonwoods, full and dark green, and moving slightly in the evening wind, and she thought about her mother in Missouri who had come to visit twice, and who had shaken Bernard's hand the first time with an expression that clearly meant she approved, and who had, on her second visit, sat on this same porch and said quietly to Inez that she had done well. And Inez had known that she did not only mean the ranch or the husband or the children, but the whole of it, the life. She thought about Clara and Roy in the house to the south, comfortable now in the way of people who have found their footing after a shaky start, with little Inez Totham, who was 13, and had her aunt's eyes and a laugh that carried across the flat land to the Hartwell porch on still nights. She thought about James Marsh, who was 21 now and working as a hand for Pete, who had indeed gotten his own piece of land nearby and was doing well. She thought about Thomas Pickering, whom she had heard from the previous Christmas, an engineer now with a practice in Wichita, who had written to say that he had begun teaching evening mathematics classes for working men, and that he thought of her when he stood in front of a room and looked out at the people who were, if he did his job right, about to discover they were capable of more than they thought. She thought about herself, stepping off a stagecoach with a leather trunk and a worn bonnet, and a story about why she was going west, and she thought about how the truest stories are sometimes the ones you don't know you're in yet. "I never thanked you properly," she said. Bernard looked at her. "For what?" "For the little house," she said. "For renting it to me, for being the kind of man you are." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You don't need to thank me for any of that." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He squeezed her hand and looked out at the cottonwoods, and the light went down behind them in the way it did every evening, pulling the colors out of the sky one by one, until what was left was the deep blue of a Kansas summer night coming in from the east, and the first stars were appearing, and the whole of the plain was quiet in the particular way it was quiet at the end of a day, full rather than empty, settled rather than silent. "You came here for your sister," he said. "I came here for my sister," she agreed. "And you stayed," he said. "I stayed," she said. "For Clara," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. She leaned her head against his shoulder, there on the porch in the last of the summer light, with the cottonwoods his father had planted standing tall in the darkening distance, and her hand in his, and the Hartwell spread settled and alive all around them. The little house to the south, with its lamp burning for the young couple from Illinois who would move on eventually and leave it for whoever came next. And the main house behind them, warm with the smell of supper and the sound of Aliner's voice in the back room and Thomas's boots on the floor above. "For Clara," she said, "and for everything else." He put his arm around her, and she settled in, and the stars came out one by one over the flat Kansas horizon, and the cottonwoods stood in the dark, and the land that had asked Bernard Hartwell what he was going to do with his life looked on, patient and honest as it had always been, at the answer he had built on it, year by year and day by day, in the company of the woman who had moved into the little house on his property just to be closer to her sister, or so she said.